You know what's absolutely wild? Right now, as you're watching this, 20 different Asian countries are scratching their heads wondering how Malaysia pulled off something they've been desperately trying to replicate for decades. And I'm not talking about some small thing here. I'm talking about an economic transformation so extraordinary that it's become the blueprint everyone wants to copy but somehow can't. By the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly why Malaysia succeeded where giants like Indonesia, Thailand, and even oil-rich nations fail miserably. And the secret ingredient is going to shock you because it's hiding in plain sight. Let me paint you a picture. It's 1957. Malaysia just gained independence. The country is poor, divided, dealing with communist insurgency. And frankly, nobody expects much from this little nation squeezed between powerhouses. Fast forward to today, and Malaysia is punching way above its weight class with a GDP per capita that leaves most of its neighbors in the dust. But here's where it gets interesting. Every single country around Malaysia saw this transformation happen and said, "We want that too." 20 countries tried. 20 countries are still trying. And 20 countries are learning a very expensive lesson about why copying someone's homework doesn't always work. Now, before you think this is just another boring economics video, stick with me, because what I'm about to reveal involves secret government strategies, billions of dollars in mistakes, and a twist that even the smartest economists didn't see coming. Indonesia was the first to notice. They looked at Malaysia and thought, "We're basically the same. We speak similar languages. We share history. We have more people and more resources. This should be easy." They created their own version of Malaysia's special economic zones. They copied the tax incentives. They even hired some of the same consultants Malaysia used. And you know what happened? It flopped spectacularly. The question is why, and the answer is going to make you rethink everything you know about economic development. Thailand watched Malaysia's rise, and they weren't about to be left behind. They had one massive advantage: tourism. Everyone loves Thailand. So they thought, let's take Malaysia's industrialization model and supercharge it with our tourism money. They built the infrastructure. They created the policies. They spent billions. And here's the kicker. They actually got closer than Indonesia did. But there was still something missing. Something fundamental that Malaysia had figured out that Thailand couldn't crack. And this missing piece is the same reason 19 other countries failed too. Vietnam looked at Malaysia and saw a roadmap. They were coming out of decades of war and isolation, and Malaysia's transformation from agriculture to manufacturing to services seemed like the perfect model. Vietnam is smart. They're hard workers. They have incredible discipline. They literally copied Malaysia's policies word for word in some cases. They created their own version of Malaysia's multimedia super corridor. They offered the same tax breaks to foreign investors. They built similar infrastructure. And Vietnam actually made significant progress, but they hit a ceiling, a glass ceiling that they're still struggling to break through today. And understanding why requires knowing something about Malaysia that most people completely miss. The Philippines saw what was happening and joined the race. They had English speakers. They had connections to the West. They had an educated workforce. On paper, they should have been able to replicate Malaysia's success easily. They created economic zones modeled after Malaysia's. They tried to attract the same industries. They even succeeded in building a massive business process outsourcing industry. But something was still off. The Philippines couldn't achieve that same balanced, sustainable growth that Malaysia managed to create. And the reason why is connected to a decision Malaysia made in the 1970s that seemed completely insane at the time. Pakistan looked at Malaysia with intense interest. Both countries are Muslim-majority nations. Both gained independence around the same time. Both faced ethnic and religious diversity challenges. Pakistan thought, if Malaysia can do it, we definitely can. They studied Malaysia's model intensively. They sent delegations. They tried to implement similar policies. They created their own special economic zones. But Pakistan's attempt to replicate Malaysia's success became a case study in what not to do. And the failure reveals something crucial about what makes Malaysia's model actually work. Bangladesh jumped in next. They saw Malaysia's success in manufacturing and thought, we have the people, we have the willingness to work, we can do this. They focus heavily on textiles and garments, trying to use that as a springboard like Malaysia used electronics. Bangladesh actually built a successful garment industry, one of the world's largest, but they couldn't make the leap that Malaysia made to higher value industries. They got stuck, and they're still stuck today. The question is, what did Malaysia know that Bangladesh didn't? Sri Lanka studied Malaysia's model and tried to implement it in the 2000s. They had a beautiful country, strategic location, educated population. They created their own economic zones. They tried to attract foreign investment with similar incentives to Malaysia. For a while, it looked like it might work. Then everything collapsed spectacularly. And if you've been following the news, you know Sri Lanka faced an unprecedented economic crisis recently. The connection between their failed attempt to copy Malaysia and their eventual crisis is something nobody talks about, but it's absolutely there. Cambodia looked at Malaysia and saw hope. They were rebuilding after decades of tragedy. Malaysia's model seemed perfect, a way to rapidly industrialize and create prosperity. They opened special economic zones. They offered tax incentives. They tried to attract the same industries Malaysia had successfully courted. But Cambodia discovered something frustrating. Having the policies on paper and actually implementing the Malaysian style are two completely different things. And the gap between those two things is where the magic actually happens. Myanmar tried to follow Malaysia's playbook when they started opening up. They had natural resources. They had a large population. They had a strategic location. On paper, it should have worked. They created economic zones modeled after Malaysia's. They offered similar incentives. Foreign companies actually showed interest. But Myanmar's attempt revealed something crucial about timing and sequencing that Malaysia had gotten perfectly right, and that everyone else keeps getting wrong. Laos looked at Malaysia's success and wanted in. They're landlocked, which is a disadvantage, but they try to compensate by becoming a regional manufacturing hub and energy exporter. They studied Malaysia's policies. They created their own special economic zones. They built infrastructure. But Laos discovered that there's a hidden complexity to Malaysia's model that isn't obvious from the outside. It's like watching someone perform magic and thinking you can do it too just by copying the hand movements. But you're missing the actual mechanism that makes the trick work. Now, let's talk about the Middle Eastern countries that tried to copy Malaysia. Brunei is right next to Malaysia, shares similar culture and history, and has way more oil money per capita. You'd think they could easily replicate Malaysia's diversification success. They tried. They created similar economic zones. They offered incentives. They had all the money in the world to invest. But Brunei couldn't break free from oil dependence the way Malaysia managed to. And the reason why it tells us something profound about what really drives Malaysia's success. The UAE looked at Malaysia's Islamic finance sector and thought, we can do that better. They have more money, more connections, better infrastructure. They created their own Islamic finance hubs. They copied regulations from Malaysia. They hired talent from Malaysia. And they did build something impressive, but they couldn't replicate the whole ecosystem that Malaysia created. There was something about how Malaysia integrated Islamic finance with manufacturing, with services, with technology that the UAE couldn't quite capture. Saudi Arabia has been watching Malaysia for decades. In their Vision 2030 plan, you can see Malaysia's fingerprints everywhere. They're trying to diversify from oil using strategies Malaysia pioneered. They're investing hundreds of billions. They have every advantage you can imagine. But Saudi Arabia is discovering what every other country discovered. Malaysia's model isn't just about policies and investments. There's something else. Something deeper. Something that you can't just buy or copy. Kazakhstan and Central Asia studied Malaysia as a model for resource-rich nations trying to diversify. They have oil and gas like Malaysia. They have ethnic diversity like Malaysia. They're trying to balance tradition and modernization like Malaysia. They've implemented policies inspired by Malaysia's approach. They've created special economic zones. They've invested in education and infrastructure. But Kazakhstan keeps running into the same wall that everyone else hits. The model doesn't quite work the same way when you transplant it. Jordan looked at Malaysia as a Muslim country that successfully modernized and thought they could learn from that experience. Jordan created special economic zones based on Malaysia's model. They tried to attract similar industries. They focused on education and human capital like Malaysia did. Jordan actually made some progress, but they couldn't achieve that same comprehensive transformation. And understanding why requires knowing something about Malaysia that even many Malaysians don't fully appreciate. Egypt tried to implement Malaysian-style reforms multiple times over the past few decades. They have a huge population, strategic location, historical significance. They created industrial zones modeled after Malaysia's. They tried to attract foreign investment with similar incentives. They attempted to replicate Malaysia's focus on manufacturing and exports. But Egypt's attempts revealed something crucial. Malaysia's success isn't just about the big visible policies. It's about thousands of small decisions and implementations that create a functioning ecosystem. Azerbaijan looked at Malaysia as a fellow oil-producing Muslim nation and saw a blueprint for diversification. They studied Malaysia's policies intensively. They created economic zones. They invested in infrastructure and education. They tried to position themselves as a manufacturing hub. But Azerbaijan discovered what everyone discovers. The gap between understanding Malaysia's model intellectually and actually implementing it successfully is enormous. Uzbekistan recently started looking to Malaysia as a model for economic transformation. They're trying to modernize, attract foreign investment, diversify their economy. They're studying Malaysia's special economic zones, tax incentives, and industrial policies. They're literally sending delegations to Malaysia to learn. But Uzbekistan is probably going to learn the same lesson everyone else learned. And that lesson is the real secret I'm about to reveal. Now here's what actually makes Malaysia different. And this is going to blow your mind because it's not what any of these 20 countries focused on. They all looked at Malaysia's policies, the tax incentives, the special economic zones, the infrastructure investments, the focus on education. They copied all of that, but they missed the actual secret ingredient. Malaysia succeeded because of something that happened way back in the 1970s that created a unique institutional framework that nobody else has been able to replicate. And I'm not talking about the new economic policy that everyone knows about. I'm talking about something deeper. Malaysia created something called pragmatic multiculturalism in their economic policy. Now that sounds like boring academic language, but what it actually means is wild. Malaysia has Malays, Chinese, Indians, and indigenous groups. That diversity could have torn the country apart, and it almost did in 1969. But instead of choosing one group's economic approach over others, Malaysia created a system that strategically leveraged each group's strengths while maintaining enough competition to drive innovation. The Malays had political power and understanding of local dynamics. The Chinese had business networks and entrepreneurial energy. The Indians had professional expertise and connections to global markets. Malaysia didn't try to erase these differences or favor one over the other. They created a framework where competition and cooperation between these groups became an economic engine. Every country that tried to copy Malaysia missed this because it's not a policy you can write down. It's an emergent property of how Malaysian society organized itself economically. Indonesia tried to copy Malaysia, but they couldn't replicate this dynamic because their ethnic Chinese minority is much smaller and more politically marginalized. Thailand tried, but they have a more homogeneous society without the same competitive dynamics. Pakistan tried, but their ethnic divisions manifest differently. Vietnam tried, but they're even more homogeneous. The Philippines tried, but their economic structure is dominated by a small elite in a completely different way. Here's what's even more interesting. Malaysia's government didn't fully understand what they were doing at first. The new economic policy was supposed to help Malays catch up economically, but because they implemented it pragmatically rather than ideologically, they accidentally created a system where different groups competed to add value in different parts of the economy. Chinese businesses focused on manufacturing and trade. Malay enterprises grew in services and government-linked companies. Indian professionals dominated certain skill sectors. And, crucially, they all needed each other. The competition drove efficiency. The interdependence created stability. The diversity meant Malaysia had connections to different global networks simultaneously. When foreign companies came to Malaysia, they found Chinese partners who understood East Asian business culture, Malay partners who could navigate government and local markets, and Indian partners who could connect to Western and South Asian markets. No other country in Asia offered this combination. Thailand had strong local business networks, but not the same diversity. Indonesia had diversity, but not the same framework for economic cooperation. Singapore had diversity, but in a much smaller scale and different context. But here's the twist that makes this even more fascinating. Malaysia's model is actually impossible to copy deliberately. You can't engineer this kind of social and economic ecosystem from scratch. It emerged from Malaysia's specific history, the British colonial legacy that brought different groups together, the trauma of 1969 that forced compromise, the natural resources that provided space for different groups to prosper, the timing of independence that put Malaysia in the sweet spot of global manufacturing expansion. Every country trying to copy Malaysia is essentially trying to replicate an accident of history. Indonesia has way more natural resources than Malaysia, but their ethnic Chinese minority is only about 2% of the population versus 30% in Malaysia at independence. That completely changes the economic dynamics. Thailand is more homogeneous, so they can't replicate Malaysia's multi-ethnic competition model. Pakistan's ethnic divisions are regional and religious in ways that create conflict rather than economic competition. The Middle Eastern countries trying to copy Malaysia have imported labor forces instead of integrated multi-ethnic citizens, which creates completely different dynamics. Vietnam might be the closest to succeeding because they're strategically creating something similar through deliberate policy. They're attracting foreign investment, building manufacturing capacity, investing in education, maintaining pragmatic economic policies despite political ideology. But even Vietnam faces a ceiling because they don't have Malaysia's diverse internal networks and connections to different global systems. They're building one type of economic engine where Malaysia accidentally built several that work together. Here's what's really wild. Malaysia itself doesn't fully understand what made its model work. Malaysian politicians and economists often credit different things: the new economic policy, good governance, natural resources, strategic location, timing, leadership. They're all partially right, but they're missing the core dynamic. It's like asking a fish to explain water. Malaysians are swimming in this unique multi-ethnic competitive cooperative economic ecosystem, and they think other countries have it too. That's why Malaysian consultants who go to other countries to help them replicate the Malaysian model often fail. They give advice about policies and institutions, but they can't transplant the actual social and economic dynamics that make those policies work. The 20 countries that tried to copy Malaysia made the same mistake in different ways. They saw the visible parts of the system: special economic zones, tax incentives, industrial policies, education investments. They copied those. But the visible policies are just the surface. Underneath is this complex network of relationships, competitions, cooperations, and connections that emerge from Malaysia's unique circumstances. It's like copying the recipe for a dish without realizing success depends on specific local ingredients that don't exist anywhere else. Indonesia keeps trying to crack the code. They created special economic zones in Batam, trying to replicate Penang's success. But Batam doesn't have Penang's mix of Malay, Chinese, Indian, and international communities, creating that unique business ecosystem. Thailand's Eastern Economic Corridor is explicitly modeled after Malaysia's approach. They've invested tens of billions, but they're building on a different social and economic foundation, so they get different results. The Philippines created special economic zones that attracted call centers and business process outsourcing. That's a success, but it's not the balanced manufacturing services technology ecosystem Malaysia built. The fundamental problem these 20 countries face is that Malaysia's success is path-dependent. The decisions made in the 1960s and 70s created conditions that made the decisions in the 80s and 90s successful, which created conditions that made the 2000s successful. You can't just jump to the end result. You need the whole historical sequence. It's like trying to become a chess grandmaster by memorizing grandmaster games without understanding how they learned and developed their skills over decades. Pakistan's special economic zones fail because Pakistan doesn't have the institutional trust and multi-ethnic business cooperation that makes Malaysia's zones work. Bangladesh gets stuck in low-value manufacturing because they don't have Malaysia's diverse connections to different technology and knowledge networks. Sri Lanka's economic zones attracted some investment, but couldn't create the clustering effects and value chain integration Malaysia achieved. Cambodia's zones work for basic manufacturing, but can't support the move up the value chain Malaysia managed. Myanmar's attempt revealed the sequencing problem. Malaysia built human capital before attracting advanced manufacturing. Myanmar tried to do it simultaneously, and it didn't work. Laos discovered the network effects problem. Malaysia's success in one zone supported success in another zone as companies and skills move between them. Laos's isolated zones don't create the same synergies. Brunei found that having money isn't enough. Malaysia diversified not just because of policy, but because diverse groups were competing to build businesses in different sectors. The Middle Eastern countries face a different version of the same problem. They have money and they can build infrastructure and create policies. But they import labor instead of having integrated multi-ethnic citizen populations. That completely changes the dynamics. Imported workers send money home. They don't build local businesses. They don't create intergenerational human capital. The UAE's success in finance is real but narrow. They can't replicate Malaysia's broad-based manufacturing services technology ecosystem. Kazakhstan's oil-funded diversification efforts keep hitting walls because they're trying to create what Malaysia has through top-down planning and investment. But Malaysia's diversification emerged from bottom-up entrepreneurship by different ethnic groups competing and cooperating simultaneously. Jordan's educated population and strategic location aren't enough because they lack Malaysia's internal diversity and connections to different global networks. Egypt's large population becomes a challenge rather than an advantage without the institutional frameworks Malaysia developed. Azerbaijan's recent growth has been impressive, but it's hitting the same ceiling everyone hits. They can attract foreign investment in specific sectors, but they can't create that integrated ecosystem where manufacturing, services, finance, and technology all reinforce each other. Uzbekistan is just starting to try copying Malaysia, and they'll probably learn the same expensive lesson everyone else learned. So what's the actual lesson here? Malaysia succeeded because of a unique combination of factors that emerged from its specific history and can't be deliberately replicated. The multi-ethnic composition created internal competition and diverse global connections. The timing of independence coincided with the rise of Asian manufacturing. The natural resources provided a cushion for experimentation and development. The political trauma of 1969 forced pragmatic compromise over ideology. The size was perfect, big enough to matter, but small enough to be agile. 20 countries tried to copy the visible parts of Malaysia's success. They all failed because success isn't about the policies you can see and copy. It's about the underlying conditions that make those policies effective. You can build special economic zones anywhere, but you can't make them work like Malaysia's without Malaysia's unique ecosystem. You can offer tax incentives, but foreign companies choose locations based on much more than taxes. You can invest in education, but you can't instantly create the networks and know-how that Malaysian institutions developed over decades. The irony is that Malaysia's greatest achievement isn't something they can export or teach. Other countries can learn principles from Malaysia's experience, but they can't copy the model because the model is inseparable from Malaysia's unique circumstances. Indonesia needs to find its own path leveraging its own strengths. Thailand needs to build on what makes Thailand unique. Vietnam is actually doing this successfully by learning from Malaysia, without trying to become Malaysia. The real lesson from these 20 failed attempts isn't that Malaysia's model is perfect or that other countries are doing something wrong. The lesson is that economic development is deeply contextual. What works in one place doesn't necessarily work somewhere else. The policies matter, but they're not the whole story. The institutions matter, but they emerge from specific historical conditions. The leadership matters, but they're operating within constraints and opportunities unique to their context. Malaysia got lucky in some ways. They had the right mix of circumstances at the right time, but they also made smart decisions within those circumstances. The genius wasn't in creating some revolutionary new model. The genius was in pragmatically working with what they had, their diverse population, their resources, their location, their timing. They didn't try to be like Japan or South Korea or Taiwan. They became their own thing. Every country trying to copy Malaysia would do better to ask not how can we be like Malaysia, but what are our unique strengths and how can we leverage them? Indonesia's massive population and archipelago geography create different opportunities than Malaysia's. Thailand's tourism and central location in mainland Southeast Asia are different advantages. Vietnam's northern and southern dynamics create different possibilities. Each country has its own version of what could work if they stopped trying to copy someone else's homework. The 20 countries that failed to copy Malaysia actually taught us something more valuable than Malaysia's success story alone. They taught us that there are no universal blueprints for development. They taught us that context matters more than we think. They taught us that what looks simple from the outside is usually complex underneath. They taught us that accidents of history create opportunities that can't be manufactured. So the next time someone tells you they figured out the secret to economic development, and any country can do it if they just follow these steps, remember the story of 20 countries trying to copy Malaysia. Remember that success is contextual, complex, and often depends on factors that can't be copied. Remember that what works is usually inseparable from where and when it works. And maybe, just maybe, we'll stop looking for universal answers and start appreciating the unique paths different countries take to prosperity.